Góðan daginn og velkomin á fyrirlestararöð Þjóðminjasafns Íslands. Í dag ætla William Short og Reynir Óskarson frá Hurstwig að segja okkur frá hlutverki tilrauna og fornleifafræði í sögulegum rannsóknum og þá sérstaklega frá járngerðartilraunum á Eiríksstöðum. Og þessi fyrirlestur í tengslum við opnun sýningarinnar úr mýri í málm sem að opnaði hér á laugardag og ég býð ykkur hér í salnum allavega að koma og kíkja svo sýninguna. Fyrirlesturinn verður á ensku og þá vil ég bara bjóða William, velkomin.
Thank you. So thank you all for joining us today. We're honored to be here, truly honored to be invited to the museum and grateful to the museum, to Ron, to Arman for this exhibit upstairs on the iron and for giving us this opportunity to talk about our work that has been going on for more than 20 years and work that has included many more than just the two of us. And you'll see many of those people in the presentation. And what we'd like to do is talk about our use of experimental archaeology in our research. It's the tool that we used for unlocking the secrets of how iron was made in early Iceland. It's a fascinating and valuable tool, and basically it is a research tool. It's a way to test hypotheses about ancient cultures. We create a hypothesis about some aspect, and then we test it in the material world using the scientific method. And in essence, it will no longer be just a theory in our heads, but it will be tested physically. And we analyze the results to see if they're consistent with a hypothesis. So an example of that is, how did Vikings use a sword? To find out, we must test it. And at Hurstwig, we test everything. And that is, in many ways, what separates us from other people doing work in the Viking field. First, we start by gathering information. We'll look at the archaeology of swords. We'll look at what the literary sources say about swords. We'll look at pictorial sources that show swords. And we'll use other sources. And then we'll go on to, for instance, using computer modeling to understand the capabilities of swords and the limits of swords. And then we'll use kinesiology studies. We'll look at how the human body interacts with the weapon. And then we will use laboratory measurements, where we go into the lab and actually measure its results. And then we'll do cutting tests to animal carcasses to look at the capability of the weapons. And then we'll complete the picture with some kind of force-on-force testing. So experimental archaeology is much more than just academic testing. It's a journey, it's an adventure, and we'll try to explain our journey and this tool in the best way we know how, and that is our journey. So we are Hurstwig. We are a team that scientifically researches the combative methods of the Vikings, but also many other Viking-related topics. And it's hard to fit us into a category. We are not reenactors. These people bring happiness and they bring the Viking Age to life in a very different way than we can. We are, in some bizarre way, scientists. And I'd like to say a few words about how we came to this place and how I came to this place. Before this, in a previous life, I was a researcher in a technical field, and my specialty was acoustics and human hearing and sound. And I knew nothing about Vikings and had no interest in Vikings. And one day I learned that there were these stories called sagas, and I read one and liked it. I read a few more and really liked it, and I wanted to learn a lot more. And I discovered that there was a summer course here in Iceland. And 24 years ago, I came and took the summer course and fell in love with the stories and with the place and the people. And eventually, studying Vikings became my full-time job. And the focus, strangely enough, was on the combat, probably one of the least researched aspects of Viking life. And it was a strange choice for me because I had no martial arts training, no martial arts experience, but eventually it became my full-time job. Now, there was a lot that could be learned from the available sources. So archaeological sources, we could look at weapons from the Viking Age, or we could look at skeletal remains from the Viking Age, and lots to learn from the literary sources, from here in Iceland, but also from Scandinavia and from other lands that the Vikings touched. But there's a problem, and that is that fighting is a physical activity. We could have theorized from here to the moon, but to misquote the boxer Mike Tyson, everyone has a theory on how fighting will be until they get punched in the nose. In some ways, it's like trying to understand what a rose looks like if no one has ever smelled, or what a rose smells like, if no one has ever smelled a rose for the last 1,000 years. You can read a book about it. You can look at dried out, decaying roses from a long time ago. You can look at pictures of roses. But these will give you clues, these will give you theories, but the smell of a rose is experiential. You have to experience it. And that's where Reynir came into our research. He questioned my experimental combative archaeology. Now, he knew nothing about Vikings, but he had a lot of experience in martial arts. He had been punched in the nose many times. And so he questioned our sense of our experimental combative archaeology. So we learned a couple of things in the very early stages of our research. Now, in certain fields, academic research can only take you so far. You need to get punched in the face. And the second thing we learned is that this academic research and the experimental archaeology shouldn't merely go hand in hand, but much more than that, they should marry and have children. And then lastly, experimental archaeology is just insane fun. Can you imagine if this method was used to teach science and history in grundskole or mentaskole? How much fun these students would have. How many more scientists and researchers and archaeologists there would be in this world. Reynir?
So a few comments about these pictures we see. This one there, if I can make it. Yeah, this one here. This is sort of the icon of entertainment we are doing education and research. Here I'm jumping in. It can be exciting, adventurous, and even life-threatening. So here I'm jumping in the deep end of a pool, wearing a chainmail to see if I float or sink. But yes, this is how education can be fun. And here I'm teaching the groundwork of Glíma, the wrestling of Vikings. And I assume some teachers would really like to, or not, but that's another thing. So, how do I?
Space.
So but every journey of adventure, every journey of excitement and research, every journey where you intend to slay a dragon or discover new worlds has traps and pitfalls. So this is not only a journey of adventure, it is also a journey of cautionary tale. And we put it all under the umbrella term of modern mindset. And modern mindset means everything we hold true for the simple sake that it is true. And I will go through these, some aspects of the modern mindset, what we put under this umbrella, sort of step by step. So the first one I'll start with is ultimate authority. And ultimate authority means a well-regarded scholar or an influential person said something, and therefore it is true. And this has happened many times throughout history, and is still happening today. And I'll name two examples. That is the rarity of swords. Now, somebody in, let's say, 1950 said that there was that swords were rare, exotic, a status symbol, really similar to a Ferrari. But I hope this is a Ferrari. I don't know what it looks like. But when we did our book, Men of Terror, we had to really analyze things. So when we found a truth that we didn't have evidence behind or logic behind, we had to really analyze what does it mean. So we analyzed the picture stones, a lot of swords. We analyzed the literary sources, a lot of swords. And then we analyzed archaeology. And we could see in Norway that swords make up a large percentage. And some of these spears are hunting spears, and some of these axes are wood axes. And in Iceland, not that few swords overall. So that means this Ferrari is at best a Land Cruiser. It has downgraded to that. Not as rare or prestigious as once thought. And another example is the concept that all Viking men and women try to attain, that is being a drengur. Being a drengur has been translated, it was translated, I assume, most influentially in Sigurður Nordal's really good book, Íslensk menning. There he translated it as brave, high-minded, or honorable. And we, along with everybody else, just accepted that. He is a scholar with high reputation. He has done some serious work. But again, we had to do some deep analysis. And then we found there was an aspect missing from this. And that is the essence of trust. That is the key aspect of drengur, being a drengur. And when you understand that it's about trust, more so than honor or being brave, it changes the whole outlook on what Vikings are. So, in some small way, we changed history. And you can applaud later, that's okay. Am I missing something, William?
No.
So, this is not so much connected to other than Viking combat, that is modern efficiency. That is taking the tools that Vikings did and using them most effectively. How can we use the tools most effectively? In the modern playing field, that is the norm. So if you take a Viking weapon, how would you use it most effectively might not be how Vikings used it at all. And I will give you an example from our own training room. When we started our 4-on-4 simulated combat, we saw ample opportunity for a punch or a headbutt or a knee strike. So we quickly thought, how can we implement this into our simulated combat? But luckily and quickly we realized the trap of the modern mindset. William even thought that this spike there was for a ramming headbutt. But quickly we realized the trap. The question should have been, did Vikings punch, kick, or knee strike? And that leads to a totally different question. The simple answer is no, they didn't. And we can see this as well in iron making. We're not looking for the most effective way to make as much iron as possible. We're trying to figure out, how did Vikings do it? Missing something? Wow, I'm doing well. So, closely connected to modern efficiency is modern constraints. And some people misunderstand this, but me and William, we are not 1,000-year-old men. We are not 1,000-year-old men from the Norse lands. We are not Vikings, in fact. And we are not modern Vikings. I don't even know what that concept means. So knowing that is really important for a variety of reasons. One of them is whatever greatness or horrors the Vikings brought on the world, we cannot claim as our own. We have nothing to do with that. It also means that whatever test we do will never fully replicate what Vikings did. And not understanding this difference will quickly lead to, for example, simulated combat to become a game, something to score points in, a game of ego. And modern constraints, in combat, modern constraints are usually done in an even playing field. Similar sized teams playing on an even field, they don't use sharp weapons. We don't even use sharp weapons. We don't try to kill our opponents because our opponents are really not our opponents. They are usually our friends or research partners or teammates. So this is the difference between simulated combat and real combat. The terrain is flat. In real combat, there would be VE, for example, superior battle location, or a rocking boat on sea. They would use sharp weapons. They would use rocks. They would use glima. The tactics are limited, and usually when you do testing, there's no spies sent beforehand, no ambushes, no houses burned down. So we allow many things, like injuries. We are okay with a sprained ankle, a bloody nose, a black eye, or bruises. But more serious injuries like amputations, we just can't do that today. So what we had to do was circumvent the modern constraints. Knowing that it's fantasy, we need to circumvent the modern constraints. And we do that in gazillion ways. We use the words of Bruce Lee, having no limitation and using no way as way. So for example, just a few examples. In sharp blade combat, shields get destroyed differently than in sharp edge combat and blunt edge combat. So we had to create sort of fake shields that would break, similar to if this was a live blade, if the blow was heavy. And because this is fantasy, and because we are rough, and because we enjoy the game, we can ignore heavy blows. with blunt weapons, something you couldn't do in real combat. So we had to invent marking weapons that would give us a real good, clear image. If this was like here we can see Willie the Legless, if the injury was, what the injury would have been. And we also do this with the psychological factor. Now we are friends, we are doing a rough game, but still there's no fear. So we created electrified weapons that gave you a shock when you got hit. So we do the many ways we go about things is just insane. Even the terrain. Here we are in a sort of skeet mix way, creating a longhouse to see how that would affect the combat itself. And here you can see there's a sword that got stuck in the crossbeams, leading to that person being killed. So we had to invent million ways. Even here, I have one of the tools we made by Barbara. So you can see it's soft enough to hook and stab, but still stiff enough to hit. So we had to circumvent these modern crusades in a million ways. And my favorite example is, of course, spear dodgeball, a sort of Mad Max pastime. We wanted to see if we would work to throw a spear at the person catching it and throwing it back to you and killing it. So we created this way to isolate and repeat the move countless times with the intent to hit the opposing team, and not always realizing when it would happen. And then we have categorization, another pitfall. And categorization means just in modern society we like to put things in neat, beautiful boxes. Everything has a place. Even though we're seeing slowly and surely that these boxes don't fit, like with gender. We had to create a new box. And we can see that this poor giraffe put in gazillion boxes. So Vikings didn't have these boxes. Not the same, at least. And our favorite example is from The Troll Inside You by Árni Jakobsson. I assume you're going to buy this book after you buy our book. And in it he talks about a troll. That a troll can mean, this one word can mean many concepts. It can mean a giant monster, it can mean a draugur, a ghost. It can mean a man with magical means, it can mean a powerful man. So one word, many concepts. But you also have the opposite. Many words for one concept. Holmganga and envy, dueling. And in every single episode they are the same. They are often used in the same sentence, apart from one episode in one saga. So, yeah, we can also see the same with Glima and Fang. Am I missing something, William?
I do not think so.
Let me continue. So this is my favorite, because this is the biggest danger area where we see a lot of things happening today. This is the zeitgeist, or wishful thinking. This is what we cherish, what we think is ideal, what we think is hip or cool today, that is pushed upon the past. Now, this is sort of like painting the past with the colors of the present. And this has been done throughout the ages, with the Victorian or Wagnerian Vikings, with the 90s movies of the barbarian cool Vikings, or even with the highly stylized Vikings of today. So, again, I must mention, we are not Vikings. So we do not cherish something that they should have been, or we try not to do. Because what we think is horrendous or terrible might be okay for Vikings. And what they thought was horrendous or terrible might be okay with us today. For example, exposure. To take these beautiful, unwanted children out and leave them there to die. Now this is not the ideas we want of our hero ancestors. A Berod. Or of course, slavery. The same thing. So we must be really careful of the zeitgeist and wishful thinking. And I'm going to pinpoint another thing. This is just personal experience and has only to do with Icelanders for some twisted reason. When we talk about something that could be made into a movie about Icelanders, something cool, then it's immediately shut down. Like, no, that can't be. So me and William are constantly talking about Vikings and combat, and the knee-jerk reaction of Icelanders is, I know they were farmers. They couldn't be warrior farmers or really prepared farmers for a fight. They need to be farmers. Or in the more recent past, when I talk about the Glima men of the past, then it's, well, Johannes, wasn't he 1/15 from Faroe Islands? Or I think he had a book on judo. Or is it Glima though, really? And all these modern mindset traps, you will see when William explains the iron-making process. So this fetish of Icelanders to belittle their ancestors is at best strange. So we take our work really seriously, and there's a reason for it. You might think that all these things here is just a peeve, a small hindrance to those who are studying this narrow field called Vikings. But in reality, it has led in the past to some horrendous things and continues to do that today, spewing hate, misinformation, and separation. So we take our job really seriously. It is not just a slight peeve for us. The next thing connected to all this is common sense. So many of the things we write in the book, or what we'll say today, is common sense, the moment after we say it to you. It took us years to figure it out, but you know it all along, just after we say it. And my favorite example is this darn piece here found in Norway. It's supposedly from the 11th century, mentioned in reference articles and books, and it halted our Glima research for a year. Because it was so terrible. So William mentioned a little bit, and he will mention again later, about layered sources, how we layer sources to all point in the same direction. They all must show the same image. Well, this damn piece here didn't. So I had to scratch my head for about a year. And then I just called the museum and said, is it possible that you're wrong? That this is not from the 11th century? And lo and behold, of course it's not. You can see the nails, of course, they are modern, and the painting is a little bit modern, the clothing style is modern, but you see this all now that I've told you. Of course you knew this. It just took the people before me about 100 years and me an extra year to figure it out. And please note, everything we talk about Glima, don't trust anything online. The Glima Association of Iceland hasn't published anything in English, so if you're unsure, check with the Glima Association. So all this regarding modern mindset can lead to flat earth research. That's where the outcome is decided upon beforehand, and then we find a logical argument why it is that way, why the outcome was the way that we thought. Yep. And my favorite example is the influence of Vikings onto the world. And I will name the Canary Islands and Korea. So we start with the outcome. Of course, Vikings influenced Canary Islands and Korea. And we'll figure out later why. So if they went from Norway or Iceland and were going to Ireland to raid or whatever we're going to do, and the current moved them a little bit, then they could have survived X amount of time on sea, actually. And this is actually usually detailed research. And therefore, they influenced the Canary Islands. And you ask, well, how? What happened? Well, their skin is lighter, and they have a similar wrestling. So we have to ignore the point, of course, that the Spanish have been there for some time, probably helping with making the skin lighter. And this belt wrestling, the belt was not introduced in Iceland until 1905. And the earliest mentioning of trouser grips in Iceland is 1847, a little bit past the Viking Age. And the same happened with the serum in North Korea. They traveled the Silk Road and they figured out this, and that's why they are in Korea. Now I'm mentioning examples just closer to my heart because it's Glima related, but you can sadly see this in academia as well. We're just gentlemen and don't mention it. Am I missing something, William?
I think that's it.
Take over. Okay.
So we've talked to you about the traps and the pitfalls. Experimental archaeology can break through these traps and these pitfalls. And when we use experimental archaeology, we test everything. We test the sources, we test our assumptions, we test ourselves, we question our own knowledge and conclusions. And an example that I always like to talk about is the example that's mentioned, a move that's mentioned many times in the literary sources of cutting off the head of a spear with a sword. Seems like it's mentioned thousands of times, a man defending the doorway of his house. And we tried it in our research lab many times, and we could never make it work. We tried different species of woods. We even tried bracing the spear in a doorway and running at it, and we could never cut off the head of the spear. And so we started looking at it further. We talked to wood experts who told us that the spear shaft is made up of all these layers of fiber, layer after layer after layer, and when you cut it with a sword, you might cut through the first layer of fiber and the second layer, but eventually the momentum of the sword is transferred to the spear shaft and they move as one. And so there's no way that you can actually cut through the spear. So we thought we had proven this both in theory and in practice, that this move in the sagas was probably an exaggeration. And then something really strange happened. In one of our simulated combat sessions, accidentally and unintentionally, we cut off the head of a spear. And I am on the left with a two-handed axe. My opponent is using a spear, and you can see I've just cut off his spear head and it's falling to the ground. All three of us are looking at it incredulously. What just happened? So we realized maybe there is something to this move that we had missed before. So we went back to the drawing board. We went back to the lab. We studied it with additional analytical tools. We used high-speed video and so on. And we realized that there was some really complex interaction in the physics between the wood fibers and the iron in the spear head. And once we'd figured it out, we could cut off the head of the spear pretty much every single time we tried. Now, in order to conduct our tests, we have to use many, many sources. No one source has all the answers. And so I'd just like to very briefly tick off the sources we use. We use pictorial sources such as picture stones, tapestries, manuscript illuminations. We use rune stones. We use literary sources, both from here in Iceland, but also other Scandinavian lands and lands that Vikings touched upon. We use etymology, the origin of a word, which tells us about the object. We use echoes of the past, the ancient ways practiced in Nordic lands that were still practiced in modern times. We use pre-Viking Age material. We use kinesiology, which is the study of body mechanics, how the body moves. We use archaeology. We use bioarchaeology, the study of skeletal remains. We use experimental archaeology, which is the focus of our talk today. And we use experimental bioarchaeology. And in all of this, we use the scientific method. It's a very, very powerful tool that allows for deductive leaps. So we start with an idea, something we'd like to test. Maybe it's something about a fighting move in the sagas. Maybe it is a question like, why was the shield the preferred defensive tool? Or is it possible to cleave a man from the head to the shoulders? And we formulate some sort of hypothesis, something that we can verify or falsify. And then we test it with an experiment. And we analyze the results to see if the hypothesis was falsified. If the answer was yes, then we might refine it a little bit and try it again. But after repeated tests and it's always falsified, we conclude that the idea is false. On the other hand, if we test it and the answer is yes, then we'll certainly want to refine the hypothesis and test it a few more times. But if it continues to test okay, we cannot claim that it is true. The best we can do is claim that it is valid, that it is good enough to continue our research until we come up with more information. And so that is how we do our testing. We do not try to prove that an idea is true. We try to falsify a hypothesis. And there's two parts to this. One part is what we call pressure testing. It's similar to what you do if you had like a tank that carried some high pressure air or gas or something, and you wanted to test it. You'd start by increasing the pressure and look for leaks. Then you'd increase the pressure more and maybe look for burst seams. And then you increase the pressure even more until the whole tank blows up. And that is what we do. That is what our journey has been. Countless air tanks blowing up as we pressure test our ideas. But the good thing is, at least a few of these tanks have held solid. So these are valuable evidence in our research. An example of this is the spear cutting or even the wooden men. Now, we also use layered sources. We do not cherry pick our sources. We do not engage in wishful thinking. We layer the sources one on top of the other to see where it breaks. So for instance, we will layer literary sources on top of archaeological sources on top of picture sources just to see where it breaks, and such as the wooden men, which broke when we laid it on top of all the other sources. Now, as we layer these sources, they all have to point in the same direction. If we layer something on top and it points in a different direction, we need to stop and understand why. What's going on? Now, maybe it's because our hypothesis is wrong. We're building up on a foundation that's not solid. Or maybe it's an object that's been misinterpreted, like the wooden men. Or maybe it's simply an outlier. In other words, if we have hundreds of sources that all point in this direction and one or two or three that point in that direction, maybe they're outliers. We're not looking for the outliers. What we're looking for is the common thread that runs throughout everything. We're trying to create a holistic picture. Whether that be Viking combat or some other aspects of Viking, what we seek is the common thread that will allow us to create this holistic picture. So, now that you've seen a little bit of the hows and whys of how we do our research, I'd like to talk about our adventure in understanding iron making here in early Iceland. And this experiment illustrates virtually all the pitfalls that Reynir talked about earlier. Now, before we go into the how we did the research and what we discovered, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the why. Why did we go to all this effort to try to understand early iron making? And I think the universal truth among Icelanders has always been that Icelandic iron from the settlement era, from around that early period, was crap, utter rubbish. So bad that weapons made out of it had to be straightened out underfoot because they bent in battle. But when I visited Avar in the east of Iceland, I was shown these mountains of iron slag, the waste from iron making. And so I was really puzzled. I went and looked at the archaeological report for the site, and the archaeologist said that about 1,000 tons of iron was made at this site in the first few centuries of Iceland's history. And this is far more than a single farm needs, far more than the whole district needs during this period. And this was only one of many iron-making farms in this district. And then we have archaeologists such as Margaret and Gudmundur who are excavating iron-making sites. And it led to conflicting ideas in my mind. You know, if it's true that Icelandic iron was so poor, why did they make so much of it? Far more than they need for domestic purposes. So we set out to understand what was going on. What was the quality of Icelandic iron during this early age? Now, a quick detour. Iron making had been known for centuries before the Viking Age. But as we will see, making iron was difficult. It took a lot of resources, a lot of material, and a lot of time. So iron wasn't rare, but it was used sparingly. It was needed for farm tools, but rather than making the entire shovel out of iron, it was just a thin cutting strip of iron. Cookware was made out of iron, and it was made out of thin sheets of iron riveted together. Ships needed a lot of iron for the nails that hold the ship together. And of course, weapons would be made out of iron. Now, we have a good idea of how iron was made in Viking Age Scandinavia. But it seems likely that iron was different here in Iceland. For instance, Landnámabók tells us that the first settler to make iron in Iceland was not one of the early settlers, but someone who came later. And we have the secondary problem, the traps of this modern mindset, that Icelandic iron was crap. So where did this idea come from? So maybe it came from the literary sources. We have a couple of examples in the literary sources where a sword bends during a fight and the fighter straightens it out, such as Laxdæla saga and Eyrbyggja saga, two that immediately come to mind. And even in the modern times, we have Halldór Laxness in Gerpla, talking about swords bending. So perhaps all of this is flat earth research that we talked about. Someone made the conclusion that Icelandic iron was crap in the early days, and they went looking for sources to back it up. And the literary sources say that Icelanders were straightening out their bent weapons underfoot. Ergo, Icelandic iron is crap. And this approach leads to rubbish. First of all, it's unlikely that any Viking swords were made in Iceland out of Icelandic iron in that time. The evidence suggests that few swords were even made in Scandinavia during this period. And perhaps the sword bending is simply an outlier. There's hundreds and hundreds of examples of swords being used in battle in the sagas of Icelanders, but only a handful where the sword is said to have bent. So it fits in with this knee-jerk reaction of Icelanders that Icelandic in the ancient times couldn't have done anything worthwhile. So where did this idea that the iron was poor come from? Has anyone tested it? How do they know? And that was the question we wanted to answer. So here's our conjecture. First of all, there's a lot of evidence for a lot of iron being made in Iceland. So why make a lot of iron if the iron is crap? So we create a hypothesis. Hypothesis number one, Icelandic iron was good. And then we're going to use the scientific method to try to falsify it. And then there's the evidence that Icelandic iron was made in many places around the land. And I believe more have been identified since this map was made. So it seems unlikely, because so much material is needed, it seems unlikely that this material would be transported either across Iceland or even from Scandinavia. So hypothesis 2 is that Icelandic iron was made with local, readily available materials. And again, we're going to use the scientific method to falsify it. So here are our research questions. Is it possible to make iron from all Icelandic materials? And is the iron good enough for making high-quality tools and weapons? So our approach was to do a joint project. Hurstwig joined with experts here in Iceland and international experts to create a team. Archaeologists studying iron-making sites, geologists, high-temperature material experts, forestry experts, wood experts, smiths, people who had done iron-making experiments before, people who had done experimental archaeology before. And we developed this team and started our research project. Before we go deeply into that, I'd like to say a few words about how iron was made in the early medieval period. Iron starts from iron ore, and there's some examples up here. Feel free to come up and take a look of some Icelandic ore. Now, the problem with ore is iron combined with oxygen. It's rust. It's crumbly. It has no strength. And so the iron smelting process takes this useless iron ore and turns it into good quality, nearly pure iron that has the strength that we need. And it's done inside an oven. And in the oven, a complex set of conditions are created. And these conditions rip the oxygen off of the iron ore to leave us with pure iron. And the way this is done is that charcoal is burned, and it creates very high temperatures in the oven. But importantly, it creates an atmosphere of carbon monoxide, and the carbon monoxide is such that it wants to rip away these oxygen molecules, oxygen atoms from the ore. Now, it's a complex process. There's many different chemical reactions taking place at different parts of the oven. And the iron drops to the bottom, the pure iron drops to the bottom into a liquid bowl of glassy slag. Now, slag is a waste product, but it's necessary for making iron because the slag, the liquid slag, protects the iron from recombining with the oxygen and turning back to rust. Now, in the actual running of the oven, it's very important to control the level of the slag. Too much and it will drown the process. So the slag is drained off occasionally, and we see that in archaeological finds. We see the hardened slag. It hardens like lava. Now, inside the oven, the iron is not melted. It's not hot enough to melt it. What we have is solid bits of very, very hot iron that fall through the oven and collect at the bottom in the bowl of slag. And here's what it looks like through a window in the side of the oven. And you can see little tiny bits of pure iron dropping down where they're collected into the bowl. Now, in the bowl, these things don't form a solid structure. They form like a spongy type of material called a bloom. And after the process is run, and it usually takes all day, a door in the bottom of the oven is opened and the bloom is taken out. Now, right away, the bloom is worked. It's hammered to try to squeeze it together into a more solid structure, to remove all these air spaces. In the Viking Age, there's evidence that the smith would use an axe to open up the bloom and look inside to see or test the quality of the iron. And we can see that in artifacts here in the museum, where the bloom has been split open to be tested. Now, when this bloom comes out, it's still not ready to be used for anything. The smith must take it and try to purify it, and he will fold it and hammer it, fold it and hammer it to try to push out some of the impurities. But when he is done, he has created an iron bar of nearly pure iron. And this bar can then be turned into useful tools and weapons. So the process uses a lot of materials. And the numbers that I'm going to present here are only approximations. It varies from run to run to run. So for a kilogram of iron that could be turned into a tool or a weapon, we're going to need 2 kilograms of iron bloom out of the oven. To do that, we're going to need 4 to 8 kilograms of ore and 8 to 16 kilograms of charcoal. Now, in our early research, we started looking at numerous sources. First, the archaeology. What does the archaeology tell us about iron making in early Iceland. So for instance, at Skogar and Auðkúla, we looked at what was found there. We looked at what we learned from the ovens that are found there, the ore that is found there, and the slag that is found there. Then we started looking at the raw materials that might have been available to the Viking Age Icelanders. First of all, the iron ore. Now, red earth is found in or near bogs, and it's available all over Iceland. Large quantities are available. Now, we need clay for the walls of the oven. The clay, first of all, resists heat, but more importantly, or very importantly, it participates in making the slag that is necessary for protecting the iron at the bottom. And here we found a big problem. And the problem is that the clay that's readily available here in Iceland is bentonite made from volcanic ash. And it's not suitable. So we'll talk more about that in a minute or two. The other material we'd like to have is silica sand. And the kind of silica sand that we would like to have for smelting, again, is not readily available here in Iceland. We looked at the plants, the material that we would need, for instance, for the charcoal. That's no problem at all. There were plenty of birch forests here in Iceland during this time. And there's archaeological evidence of charcoal making pits, so that would have been available. Now, the problem is the clay. Very simple tests showed us that Icelandic clay melts at the kinds of temperatures we need for making iron. So we needed to find something to add to the clay to make it resist that heat. We need what's called a refractory material to increase the melting temperature, and there's two good candidates, lumina and silica. Now, one possibility for these refractory materials is minerals at hot springs. And we did not turn here first. I freely admit it's not an area we investigated deeply. And perhaps our reasoning was wrong, but it did not seem that this material was readily available near all of the iron-making sites that we were familiar with. So we looked at something that was more generally available. We looked at ash made from grasses and other organic materials. And this fellow suggested another form of ash, and that is ash made from horse manure. And horse manure is used in making ovens in many other cultures. It has a lot of good structural properties. And importantly, the undigested grass in the manure burns away during the process, leaving these very small air channels which help with the process. And horse manure ash is used for other cultures as a refractory material. So it wasn't unknown. And so our experiments were to look at all these materials and do some tests and try to figure out what the quality of the iron might be. So our hypothesis was that it was possible to make iron here in Iceland, good quality iron, using all Icelandic materials and using horse manure ash as the refractory material. So we start with testing. First of all, we do elemental analyses of the iron ore available. And the iron ore available is excellent. So it's very high percentage of iron. The impurities is small percentage, and importantly, none of the impurities are anything that is going to poison the process, to hurt the process. Next, we looked at the horse manure ash that was created here in Iceland, and there's a lot of silica in it, so this looked very, very promising. Then back home in the United States, we started doing many, many smelting experiments with our own ovens. And we used a lot of different kinds of ovens. We used clay ovens, and these were used in Scandinavia using high temperature clays that were available there. We used stone ovens. There's some evidence that ovens were made out of stone. And we used turf ovens because the evidence suggests that here in Iceland, ovens were made with turf with only a thin clay liner inside to protect the turf from the heat. And we developed our skills, so our skill in making ovens, our skill in processing the raw material. So for instance, the charcoal all has to be the same size. The ore all has to be the same size. We practiced our skills in running the oven. The amount of air blast has to be very carefully controlled, and the percentage of ore to charcoal has to be controlled. And we practiced our skill at taking the bloom out of the oven without damaging it, because the evidence suggests that the ovens used in ancient times were used many, many, many times. We practiced our skills in processing the iron bloom after it came out of the oven. And once we had done that, we did our final test at Eiríksdal. The Reconstructed House is based on experimental archaeology, perhaps the home of experimental archaeology here in Iceland. And in a festival in August of 2019, we made iron. And the iron results tell us that we made excellent iron. Analysis of the iron shows us that it is nearly 100% iron with only a tiny amount of impurities. Our smith was able to make that iron into an iron bar that was more than adequate for making very high-quality weapons and tools. So the process in our mind was a success. We had proven that it was possible to make high-quality iron. Now, it wasn't complete in, for instance, the horse manure ash did not do its job perfectly. The clay did melt, and so there was a hole in the side of the oven. It didn't affect our ability to make iron. We don't know why that is. We don't know what the right refractory material is. The evidence suggests that, we have no evidence that suggests that Icelanders used horse manure ash to make their iron. There's nothing that goes against it, but nothing that proves it either. So it was purely conjectural. But what is not possible to escape is that we made high-quality iron. We had a refractory material that worked, and no one can question, even though our ovens were not 100% perfect, no one can question that high-quality iron could have been made here in the Viking times. Now, the project has all the elements that we talked about earlier, this mindset, the trap of modern mindset. Someone said that it was not possible to make good iron back in 1950 or whenever it was, and no one questioned it until we did. It has this trap of zeitgeist, this knee-jerk reaction of the lowly Icelanders unable to do anything good. It fits in with the importance of testing the source material. It fits in with the testing upon testing the clay, testing the ovens, testing many things. But importantly, it tests this immense joy and pleasure of doing experimental archaeology. And again, good people, we changed history, or at least we rewrote it a little bit. And that's the story of our using experimental archaeology. It's a tool for physically testing some aspect of ancient cultures. It's an adventure, and we invite others to extend our research, to continue the adventure, especially the iron research. We've opened the door a crack, and we'd really like someone to throw open that door and continue this research. We at Hurstwig have a number of experiments on our agenda. So we have plans for a multi-phase program to understand swords, Viking Age swords, to measure them, to model them, to understand how they interact with the swordsman. We have plans for much more Glimo research. And there's plans for another experimental archaeology workshop at Eriksstad. In addition, we'd like to hear your ideas. We'd like for you to be involved. So please contact us to be a part of this adventure. Contact Hurstwig through our website, hurstwig.com, or Facebook page, Hurstwig. Please contact the people at Eriksstad. Bjørn Heather is right here in the room. Please talk to her about her plans for the workshop. And we're eager to have your help. We're very eager to have your ideas. Thank you.
Takk fyrir. Einhverju spurningar? Ég ætla að fara með hljóðnumann þá út í sal.
So is it possible to keep a man from head to shoulders? Yeah, so Reynir brought up that you did research on if you keep a man from head to shoulders. Was it possible, and how did you conduct the research? Perhaps more interestingly even.
So you saw a little bit of that experiment in the video with the animal carcass, the pig carcass. And yes, it was not a problem to split the head down to the shoulders when we tested it on that pig. So what happens is the sword very cleanly passes through and is stopped by the spinal column. So it's just as the literary sources say, head to shoulders. I'm sorry?
I don't know the English word for wicker. Pumice as a thermal installation.
Okay. And I do not have the answer to that, because not only do we need thermal insulation, but we need something that will create the slag for the process. And I do not know if pumice will do that. Yes?
We would see it then.
Yeah, good point, yeah. So if pumice was used, then people like Margaret would see it in their excavations of the ovens at these sites, and I guess it has not been seen.
just on the pumice question, because I'm specialized in ceramics and ceramic materials. Pumice melts, so it will be excellent for making glue, for making slag, but it doesn't contain enough silica for this use.
Thank you.
At what temperature does it melt? It melts at 1260 or so.
Yeah. And in the oven, we're routinely doing 1300, even more at times. Okay.
Hi. Who was that gentleman wrestling the bear?
Our Glima expert.
Thank you, young lady. He is the reason many of us can be proud to be Icelanders. He's the man who wrestled the world, got us into the Olympics, and brought down the empire that was controlling us. Jóhannes Jósefsson, Jóhannes Borg, the owner of the maker of the Hotel Borg. Nice question.
No more.
I just wonder what was made from the iron that you made it.
It is on display here in the exhibit.
You didn't make any knives or anything from it?
No.
But if I may,
Yeah, please.
we made a whole exhibition out of it. How nice can you get? What, do you want, a fork or something? We made an exhibition.
But to make it into a brittle equipment or knife or sword, you need to put some carbon in it.
Yes.
So is that the next step on your experiments? Or?
So we have done experiments in turning iron into steel. And it seems like there is some evidence that in the bloomery furnace there was enough carbon in it that what came out was close enough to steel, and the smith would recognize that and set it aside for things that needed it. But if it was not good enough, there are processes and evidence in archaeology that there were furnaces that would add additional carbon. We have only briefly played with that. That has not been our focus. Someone else should do that work.
Hi, I'm curious, are you going to continue with these experiments, and what are the next steps?
Okay, I'll answer and then Reynir will answer because his answer will be different. So for Hurstwig, we are happy with what we have accomplished, and we'd really like someone else to pick this up. But surely there must be someone here in Iceland that can do this work and really throw open this door and answer the questions that remain unanswered. And for our group, we're moving on to the next research projects that I mentioned briefly, and especially the sword-related measurements and modeling.
Yeah, I have no idea how to answer it differently. Just we hope somebody else does this.
Yeah.
We just do what interests us at the moment. Usually that's something with blood and gore.
Yeah. Yeah. No, we're truly blessed to have so much help, so much support from Icelanders on this project. And now it's time for someone else to pick it up.
So you already established that you can cleave a head for someone from head to shoulders, and you actually can cut off someone's spear. But were there any experiments that showed that something that happens in the sagas, which seemed plausible but couldn't have happened?
Yeah. That happens a few times. I'll name my favorite example. Sadly, we don't have a video of it. It's called Kierkonka. It's a duel where you fight inside a tub. And we tried that. We took the measurements of tub in stung, kerið in stung, and actually just put it over us and tried to fight. And it was really good distance for a couple to go and kiss, but you couldn't swing any tool in there. So there are many instances like this. This is one of them.
Another example that's a little bit favorite of mine is there's a couple of examples where a man would use some long shafted weapon, a spear, etgeir, or something like that, put it through someone and throw him over his head. And we tried that multiple times, and the best we could do is maybe 5 millimeters off his toes, and that's all we could do. Throwing him, no. Okay.
Nei, þá ætlum við bara að þakka þeim William og Reynir fyrir frábæran fyrirlestur. Bara takk fyrir.
Og ef við komum að skoða það, með ég skoða. Hvað segir þið?
Alltaf lappa upp með okkur.
Döðið.